Spartacus. To Rome, he was just a number, another body to be broken in the arena. But Spartacus wasn't just a slave, he was a force of nature. Captured in Thrace and sold to a gladiator school in Capua, he was trained to die for the fun of a Roman crowd. They expected him to fight for their entertainment, but he was waiting for the right moment to fight for his life. In 73 BC, that moment came. Spartacus and 70 gladiators broke out of their school, grabbed weapons, and vanished into the shadows of Mount Vesuvius. Rome laughed at first, thinking they were just runaways. That was a huge mistake. Within weeks, his ranks were filled with thousands of farmers and shepherds, all hungry for the one thing they'd never had: freedom. When the Roman army finally trapped them, they were sure it was game over. But Spartacus saw an opening where they saw a dead end. His men wove ropes out of wild vines and rappelled down the cliffs in the middle of the night. They came down like ghosts and hit the unsuspecting Romans from behind, completely wiping them out. The idea that Rome was unbeatable had been shattered. Victory after victory followed, and soon 70,000 people were marching under his banner, cutting a path through Italy. The Roman Senate was terrified and sent their top commander, Crassus, to stop him. After months of brutal fighting, the end came in 71 BC. Facing defeat, Spartacus didn't try to run. He fought at the front of the line, charging straight at the Roman commander in one last act of defiance. In the chaos, he disappeared. His body was never found, but his legend lived on. He took on the most powerful empire in the world and proved that even a man who owned nothing could bring Rome to its knees. His story didn't just end on that battlefield. It became a symbol of courage that still echoes today. Vlad the Impaler. The Ottoman Empire in the 15th century was an unstoppable engine of conquest. It had crushed kingdoms, absorbed empires, and conquered Constantinople. Standing in its path was Wallachia, a small, rugged land led by a man forged in the shadows, Vlad III. Held hostage by the Sultan since his youth, Vlad understood the monster he was fighting. He knew that to save his people, he could not defeat such a tide with steel and honor alone. He had to unleash a different kind of weapon. He had to become a nightmare. This reached a breaking point at the night attack at Targovishte. As Sultan Mehmed II marched his massive force deep into Wallachian territory, Vlad chose to gamble everything on a single, suicidal strike. Under the cover of darkness, he led his elite guard into the heart of the enemy camp. The goal was not just victory, it was to shatter the Ottoman mind. When the sun rose, the Sultan found his path forward blocked not by an army, but by a forest of his own men, impaled, silent, and cold. The psychological shock was absolute. The momentum that had conquered the world suddenly faltered, stalled by a man who fought with the cold-blooded efficiency of a demon. Historians still argue over whether he was a sadist or simply a man desperate to preserve his sovereignty against an insurmountable force. But the truth is written in the silence of his enemies. Vlad the Impaler transformed his home into a poisoned pill that no empire would dare swallow. He exists in the space between history and myth, a defender whose brutality was so absolute it echoes through time, ensuring his name remains a synonym for fear. Björn Ironside. They called him Björn Ironside because legend claimed no blade could pierce his skin. Whether that was true or not, one thing was certain: his enemies believed it, and that belief alone made him terrifying. Björn was the son of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, growing up in a world where strength, courage, and glory meant everything. From an early age, he proved he wasn't content living in his father's shadow. He wanted to build a legend of his own. With fleets of Viking longships behind him, Björn sailed far beyond Scandinavia. He raided the coasts of France, struck the kingdoms of Spain, and pushed into the Mediterranean, waters few Norse warriors had ever dared to enter. Wealthy cities that thought distance would keep them safe suddenly found Viking sails on the horizon. Every successful raid made Björn's reputation spread farther across Europe. One of his most famous exploits became the stuff of legend. During a campaign in Italy, Björn's warriors convinced the defenders of a fortified city that their leader had died. They asked only for permission to bury him inside the city walls. But when the coffin was carried through the gates, Björn suddenly leaped out with sword in hand, allowing his waiting Vikings to storm the city. By the end of his life, Björn Ironside had become one of the greatest Viking leaders of his age. His voyages carried Norse power farther than ever before, and his exploits lived on through the Icelandic sagas for generations. More than 1,000 years later, Björn Ironside remains a symbol of the Viking spirit, bold enough to sail beyond the edge of the known world, and fearless enough to fight wherever he landed. Miyamoto Musashi. They called him the undefeated swordsman, a man who entered dozens of duels and walked away without defeat. But Miyamoto Musashi was more than a warrior. He was a man who transformed combat into an art. Born in Japan in 1584, Musashi grew up during an age of constant warfare. Drawn to the sword from childhood, he fought his first duel at just 13 years old. While others searched for power through armies and armor, Musashi searched for perfection through discipline, strategy, and understanding. As he traveled across Japan, he challenged the greatest swordsmen of his time. He studied not only how his enemies fought, but how they thought. He developed his famous two-sword technique, wielding both the katana and wakizashi in a style that broke traditional rules. His most famous duel came against Sasaki Kojiro, one of Japan's greatest swordsmen. Musashi arrived late, carrying a wooden sword carved from an oar. Many believed he was mocking his opponent. But Musashi understood something others didn't. The battle was already being fought before the first strike was ever made. His victory was not just about skill with a blade. It was about controlling fear, reading his opponent, and staying calm when others lost control. His greatest weapon was never the sword. It was his mind. Later in life, Musashi left the battlefield and wrote The Book of Five Rings, a masterpiece of strategy and philosophy that would influence warriors, leaders, and thinkers for centuries. Miyamoto Musashi was not remembered because he fought the most battles. He was remembered because he understood the deepest truth of combat. The final battlefield is always within yourself. Saint of War, Guan Yu. They called him the God of War. But Guan Yu earned his legend not through conquest alone. He became immortal because he never betrayed his honor. Born during the final years of China's Han Dynasty, Guan Yu lived in an age of rebellion and civil war. There, he met Liu Bei and Zhang Fei. Together, the three swore the famous Oath of the Peach Garden, promising to live and die as brothers. It became one of history's greatest symbols of loyalty. As kingdoms fought for control of China, Guan Yu's reputation spread across the battlefield. Wielding his legendary green dragon crescent blade, he led fearless charges against enemy armies and defeated some of the greatest warriors of his age. Soldiers respected him. Enemies feared him. His greatest test, however, was not fought with a weapon. Captured by the powerful warlord Cao Cao, Guan Yu was offered wealth, high rank, and a life of comfort. Most men would have accepted. Guan Yu refused. The moment he learned Liu Bei was still alive, he abandoned everything and rode hundreds of miles to rejoin his sworn brother, proving that loyalty meant more to him than power. His courage eventually led him into one final campaign. Surrounded by enemies, Guan Yu fought until escape was impossible. He was captured and executed in 220 AD. But death only strengthened his legend. For centuries afterward, emperors honored him, temples were built in his name, and millions came to worship him as Guan Di, the god of war. Guan Yu was remembered not simply because he was a great general, but because he proved that true strength is measured not by victory, but by honor that never breaks. Demon on the battlefield. Lu Bu. They called him the strongest warrior under heaven. On the battlefields of ancient China, one saying struck fear into every soldier. Among men, Lu Bu. Among horses, red hair. Together, they became the deadliest combination of the Three Kingdoms era. Towering over most warriors, Lu Bu possessed unmatched strength and extraordinary skill with the Fangtian Huaji, his legendary halberd. Mounted upon red hare, the fastest horse in China, he could smash through enemy formations and challenge entire armies almost alone. Few dared to face him in single combat, and even the greatest generals hesitated when his banner appeared on the horizon. His greatest display of power came at the Battle of Hulao Pass. There, Lu Bu fought the famous alliance of Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei. One warrior against three of history's greatest heroes. Yet none could defeat him. The battle cemented his reputation as the most fearsome fighter of his generation. But strength alone could not secure his future. Lu Bu repeatedly betrayed those who trusted him, changing sides whenever ambition offered a greater reward. His unmatched skill earned admiration, but his lack of loyalty left him isolated. Allies became enemies, and few remained willing to stand beside him. In 198 AD, Lu Bu was surrounded at Xiapi. Captured after a desperate defense, he pleaded for another chance, but Cao Cao refused. The greatest warrior of his age was executed, not because anyone surpassed his strength, but because no one could trust him. Lu Bu became a legend not simply because he was the strongest man on the battlefield. He became a reminder that strength can win battles, but without loyalty, wisdom, and honor, even the mightiest warrior cannot escape his own downfall. Child of the Sky, Jumong. They called him the Child of Heaven. Long before he became the founder of a kingdom, legends claim that even as a boy, his skill with the bow surpassed every warrior around him. Whether myth or history, one thing became undeniable. Jumong was born to lead. Raised in the ancient kingdom of Goguryeo, Jumong quickly earned a reputation as an extraordinary archer. His unmatched talent inspired admiration among the people, but it also stirred jealousy within the royal court. Princes who feared his growing influence plotted against him, forcing Jumong to flee and leave behind the only home he had ever known. With only a handful of loyal companions, he crossed mountains, rivers, and hostile lands in search of a new beginning. According to legend, when enemies cornered him at a great river, the fish and turtles themselves formed a living bridge, allowing him to escape and continue his journey. Jumong eventually reached the fertile lands of Jolbon, where he united scattered tribes under a single banner. Through courage, leadership, and brilliant strategy, he founded the Kingdom of Goguryeo in 37 BC, a kingdom that would grow into one of the greatest powers in East Asia and endure for more than 7 centuries. Jumong was remembered not simply because he never missed his target. He was remembered because he transformed a small band of followers into a nation. His greatest weapon was not his bow. It was the vision to inspire people to build something that would outlive them all. History remembers many warriors for the battles they won, but the greatest among them left something far more powerful than victory. Spartacus gave hope. Vlad inspired fear. Björn expanded the world. Musashi mastered himself. Guan Yu embodied honor. Lu Bu revealed the limits of strength. And Jumong built a nation. Their weapons have long turned to dust, but their stories continue to shape the world.